Craig Daniels, an auto mechanic, was spending time with his family one evening when he opened his wallet. What he saw made his chest tighten. Hardly any money inside. Bills were due, and the weight of responsibility grew heavier. He didn't say anything to his wife, but the thought followed him into the next morning. As Craig left for work, something outside his apartment caught his eye. A piece of paper was pinned to his door. He walked closer and froze. It was an eviction notice, a legal warning that shook him deeply. His home, his family's shelter, was now at risk. He pushed himself to keep going, heading to the garage where he worked. Craig started his day as usual, wiping sweat and grease from his face as he bent over engines. But soon a coworker approached and told him that Doug, his boss, wanted a word. Craig walked into the office, and moments later walked out jobless. The news hit like a hammer. He had been let go. Depressed and defeated, Craig wandered the streets. He pulled out his phone and called his wife, telling her he would be home late. He claimed he was meeting a friend for drinks, but in truth, he just couldn't face going home right away. That night, Craig stepped into a bar, sat at the counter, and tried to drown his worries. Out of nowhere, a hand grabbed him roughly from behind. Startled, Craig turned and saw Vince, an old friend he hadn't seen in 5 years. Vince laughed loudly, admitting he was only joking by pretending to be a thief. Craig was both relieved and surprised. Vince insisted on paying for his drinks, but Craig said he needed to leave. Vince wouldn't allow it. "It's been 5 years. I'm not letting you run off now," Vince said with a grin. They sat together, and Vince noticed how tense Craig looked. "You seem troubled?" Vince asked. Craig opened up about being married now, with a 15-month-old son named Keenan. He showed Vince a picture of the boy, and Vince's face lit up. But Craig also admitted that his life wasn't easy. He had just lost his job that very day, and he needed $4,500 to cover his problems. Vince thought about it but shook his head. "I don't have that kind of money. Once I broke a man's arm for $80 in front of his daughter. Can you imagine doing something like that?" Craig didn't respond, instead excusing himself to use the restroom. Inside, he briefly noticed a strange-looking man but ignored him. When he returned, Vince was sitting with a wealthy couple, Violet and Colin. Colin explained it was Violet's birthday and that's why they were out celebrating. The bartender, Corinne, brought a bottle of wine and said it cost $300. Without hesitation, Colin handed her the money. Vince introduced Craig as his old friend, and Violet happily snapped a picture of all of them together. The couple then shared a story about betting on someone at the bar. Colin said he and Violet had placed a small wager on whether a man staring at the bartender would make a move. Violet had won. Laughing, Colin suggested they all play some games of their own. The first dare was simple. Whoever finished their glass of wine first would win $50. Vince jumped in without hesitation, gulped it down, and won. He handed the money to Craig, but Colin insisted it belonged to Vince, and Vince quickly took it back. In the next round, Craig managed to win, though Vince made it seem like he let him. The games escalated. Colin pointed to a very drunk girl in the club and offered $200 to whichever of them could make her angry enough to slap them. Vince told Craig to go first. Nervously, Craig tried, but when he returned, the girl hadn't slapped him. Vince teased him, then walked up to her himself. He joked around, made an offer, and in the end, the girl smacked him across the face. Vince returned grinning, holding his prize money. As the night went on, Colin began using drugs openly. Craig tried to stop him, suggesting he at least go to the bathroom, but Colin refused, saying the restroom stank. When the bartender Corinne told him drugs weren't allowed, Colin slipped her enough money to keep her silent. Vince joined in, and then suggested they head to another club. Colin agreed, but Craig said he was going home. Vince pressed him to stay, and Colin added, "Don't spoil Violet's big night." Craig reluctantly stayed. At the next club, Colin raised the stakes again. He pulled out $200 and dared them to slap a girl inside. Craig refused outright, warning Vince not to do it. But Vince, eager as ever, rushed off and slapped the girl, sparking chaos. They all ran out laughing. Craig had had enough. He told them it was nice meeting them, but he was heading home for good. Just then, a guard approached. Colin smirked and offered Craig $500 if he punched the guard first. Hesitant but desperate, Craig swung. The guard retaliated and knocked him out cold. When Craig woke up, he found himself in unfamiliar surroundings. His pockets, however, now held cash. Confused, he realized he had been taken to Colin and Violet's house. He walked out of the room and overheard Vince talking to Colin. They explained that after he fainted, they had cleaned him up and brought him there before the cops could get involved. Both men praised Craig for being the first to hit the guard. Colin smiled and said Craig would never forget this night, even though they might never see each other again. He admitted he had always wanted to do something wild like this. Craig, however, only wanted to go home. Colin offered him painkillers, saying his house had enough medicine to be called a pharmacy. Injured and uneasy, Craig sat quietly on the couch. Violet approached him gently, cleaned his wounds, and took a picture of him, promising she would send it later. In another room, Colin showed Vince something mysterious, something that impressed Vince greatly. Meanwhile, Violet continued tending to Craig's injuries. She asked if he had ever been hurt badly before. Craig recalled once breaking his foot while skateboarding, but said he couldn't remember the pain. Violet shared her own memory. When she was little, she admired older kids skating and fell in love with one boy she watched often. One day, that boy was hit by a car. Violet didn't see the accident, but heard the crash. She grew emotional as she spoke, tears filling her eyes while she cared for Craig. Colin handed Craig some medicine, telling him it was just painkillers from the pharmacy and safe to take. After that, Colin led Craig and Vince up to the rooftop. While Colin talked with Craig, Vince, who stood close by, smirked and suddenly urinated on Craig's shoes. Craig's face turned red with anger, but Colin and Vince only burst into loud laughter, mocking him. Furious, Craig left for the bathroom to clean himself up, and Vince followed him inside. Craig was frustrated and snapped at Vince, but Vince leaned closer and whispered something darker. He said he was planning to rob the couple, claiming Colin kept a safe full of cash that was left unlocked. Craig stared at him in disbelief and called him insane, saying he only wanted to leave the house. Vince, however, kept pushing. He told Craig that Colin had $150,000 in cash and tried to convince him this was the chance they needed to start a new life. Craig shook his head and refused again. He said it was too dangerous, especially since Colin and Violet had already seen their faces. If they robbed them, the police could easily track them down. But Vince argued back, insisting Colin wouldn't dare call the police because of the drugs he was keeping. Vince warned Craig that if he didn't want to join, he should just leave. Torn between fear and desperation, Craig finally gave in. He reluctantly agreed to the plan. Vince told him to take control of Violet while he handled Colin. The two men carried out their plan. Vince grabbed Colin by the collar and demanded that he open the safe and hand over the money, while Craig held Violet. Colin calmly replied that the safe wasn't locked, but he couldn't remember the combination. Vince ordered Craig to check it himself. Craig went to the safe, opened it, and found bundles of cash. He came back carrying the money. "How much is in there?" Vince demanded. "I didn't count it," Craig admitted. At that moment, Craig noticed a framed photograph on the wall. It showed Colin receiving an award in martial arts. His stomach dropped. Before Vince realized what was happening, Colin used his martial arts skills to disarm him with ease. At the same time, Violet pulled out a gun. The tables had turned. Colin and Violet now had full control. Surprisingly, Colin didn't seem furious. Instead, he laughed lightly and said they should let bygones be bygones. He told Vince and Craig to forget what had just happened because it was Violet's birthday, and he didn't want to spoil it. Then Colin revealed something strange. The money in the safe was actually set aside for them. The unlocked safe had been part of a plan. Colin explained that they could walk away at any time, but if they wanted the money, they had to play a game. Vince's eyes lit up. "What kind of game?" he asked. Colin smiled and announced the first dare. Whoever could hold their breath the longest would get $500. As Craig prepared himself, his phone rang. It was his wife. She told him she had already spoken to Enrique, the man Craig had lied about meeting. She wasn't angry, she said, but wanted Craig to come home so they could solve things together. Craig promised her he would be home in 45 minutes and asked her to trust him. Before Craig could hang up, Colin pulled out $200 and handed it to him, telling him to hang up right away. This made Vince furious, accusing Colin of being unfair with the money. Still, Craig went ahead with the dare, holding his breath as long as he could. Colin and Violet clapped for him, cheering him on, which only made Vince even more jealous. In a desperate move, Vince punched Craig in the stomach, forcing him to lose. Colin calmly told Craig that Vince hadn't broken any rules because Colin never said there were rules in the first place. For the next challenge, Colin told them about his neighbor's dog. The dog often ruined his lawn and ruined his new shoes. Colin wanted revenge. He told Vince and Craig that whoever threw dirt on the neighbor's house would win money. The two argued, but in the end, Craig completed the dare first and won. The next dare pushed things further. Craig was told to spend intimate time with Violet. If he did, He would receive $4,500, enough to pay his rent for the month. Craig accepted and won the money, but Vince was furious. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and angry at the unfairness of the game. Guilt also consumed Craig, who regretted what he had done to his wife. Shaken, he left the game, deciding that the money he had was enough to buy time before facing eviction. Violet, however, looked hurt when Craig walked out. She had started to develop feelings for him, and without his presence, the game lost its purpose. It had been designed to entertain her, and now she withdrew into silence. Vince, desperate to keep playing, offered to do anything Colin asked. Colin smiled and gave him a shocking dare: cut off his own pinky finger for $25,000. Vince hesitated but seemed ready to accept when suddenly Craig returned. Craig admitted that the $4,500 wasn't enough. He needed more money. He offered to do the dare himself for a smaller amount. The two friends went back and forth, lowering their offers until Craig agreed to cut off his pinky for $15,000. Vince, furious but powerless, watched as Craig sliced off his finger and won again. The next challenge was even more disturbing. Colin brought out a cooked dead dog. The animal had died while trying to eat Craig's severed finger. The dare was simple. Whoever finished eating first would win $50,000. Both men struggled through the sickening task and finished at the same time. To break the tie, Colin said the winner would be whoever ate Craig's finger. Craig rushed forward, grabbed his severed pinky, and swallowed it down before Vince could react. He won again. Vince exploded with rage and attacked Craig, beating him brutally. Colin dragged Vince outside to calm him down, but instead of calming him, Colin whispered in Vince's ear, pouring fuel on the fire. He told Vince that Craig had always leaned on him for support, and now Craig was repaying him with betrayal. Colin tempted Vince with one final offer: kill Craig and win the rest of the $250,000. At first, Vince agreed, lured by greed, but when he stood face to face with his friend, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He told Craig they should leave together and forget everything before he could act on it. Craig, in a desperate moment, shot Vince dead. Colin calmly called Craig a taxi. Before Craig left, Colin handed Violet her share of the money. The couple had been betting all along on which friend would kill the other. Colin had chosen Vince while Violet had chosen Craig. Craig, shaken and bleeding, took the money and returned home. When he stepped inside, his young son Keenan ran into his arms. Craig held him tightly, tears in his eyes, but as the light flicked on, his wife appeared, staring at him. She looked at his blood-covered body and at the piles of money scattered across the floor. The room was silent, heavy with questions that Craig couldn't answer. If you enjoyed this story, I would really appreciate if you could drop a like and subscribe for future uploads. Check of my other recaps on the right and grab your popcorn. Enjoy yourself and see you soon, my friend.